Decades before Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel became synonymous with the powder trafficking in the 1980s, Colombia held a different distinction as the primary source of illicit substances feeding into the United States. What were they smuggling, you may ask? Well, it was that sticky green. What's good, y'all? This is LMC. Welcome to the Trap Tree series. We are going to explore the precursor to what everyone knows Colombia as today. If you guys are new to the channel, please hit the like button, subscribe, comment down below, follow me on the social medias, and strap in. Anyways, this is LMC. Today, we are going to talk about the history of herb smuggling in Colombia. Now, the cultivation of herbs in Colombia traces its roots back to the late colonial period, when herbs were grown for their industrial fibers. However, even during those early times, the psychoactive potential of the herb was already recognized, leading to its denouncement by the Catholic Church and the Colombian government. But to further understand the history of this plant in Colombia, let's look at the research from a book written by a person named Brito. For most of its history, Colombia had been internationally recognized for several factors, including its coffee production, the presence of obviously Marxist FARC guerrillas, and the significant influx of Venezuelan refugees in recent years. Yet, there is a lesser known but historically significant aspect of Colombia's past that deserves attention. And this hidden facet revolves around the explosion of the pot industry in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, really 60s to 70s. Now, the origins of the pot industry can be traced back to earlier economic activities, such as the cultivation of bananas and cotton, right? With time, though, the 1920s boom in banana cultivation gradually shifted towards leather production. When this happened, the growing German community in the area began supplying hides and tanning materials to Nazi Germany in the following decade. Now pay attention, because this period holds great significance in understanding the United States' long-standing interest in Colombia. You see, German encroachment highlighted Colombia's strategic importance as a crossroads connecting the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. Consequently, American officials cultivated relationships with their Colombian counterparts and successfully combated Nazi smuggling. This American influence persisted after World War II, as the United States sought to establish a capitalist foothold in South America amidst the rising threats of nationalism and communism. Collaborative efforts between the Colombian government and the US-led initiatives increased access to credit, which drove up cotton prices. However, like previous boom and bust cycles, the surge in cotton production failed to foster industrial development or widespread societal benefits. Instead, it perpetuated wealth concentration among elite plantation owners. Now, eventually though, the US and Colombian governments would enter into agreement to regulate coffee exports. Now, this would then shift smuggling culture to illicit coffee trade. Thus, in the late 1960s, coffee smugglers began including shipments of pot in their contraband, marking the inception of the pot boom. Now, what I really want to make clear here is that what happens, right, is you see different smuggling routes for certain substances. You know, it started with coffee, right? Then it moved on to pot, and then it moved on to the powder, right? We see the Colombian cartels, right? There's actually a lot of similarities with the Albanians over in Europe. The Albanians originally started with smuggling different substances, and they established those smuggling routes, and now they run the powder game in Europe, right? And there's actually now like a partnership between the Colombians and the Albanians, funny enough. That's a very important note about this whole video. So back to the history though. As the 1920s rolled in, possibly influenced by the increasing pot use in the Caribbean, the recreational consumption of pot started to emerge in the Colombian Atlantic ports. This led the Colombian government to implement stricter regulations on pot in 1939 and 1946. Now fast forward to the 1960s and 1970s, and North American pot traffickers began making inroads into Colombia, sparking a surge in production in regions like the Sierra Nevada, de Santa Marta, and the Two Peninsula. Pot became a clandestine cargo, often hidden within the massive northward shipments of bananas, and thus a pivotal moment in the fascinating history of pot smuggling in Colombia was birthed. The transition to the pot era, occupying the initial third of writer Brito's work, offers valuable insights into the power of unintended consequences. See, pot's emergence resulted from the intersection of smuggling activities in general. It initially aimed at circumventing World War II embargoes, right? And then the Cold War economic interventions by the United States. But while it might be tempting to attribute the pot boom solely to the growth in US pot consumption, Brito presents a compelling argument that it was a prior Colombian commodity which integrated the country into global markets while continuing to marginalize many Colombians. And that created the fertile ground for illicit opportunities spurred by the demand surge in the 1960s. And that said, the pot boom's emergence was not solely driven by external factors. Local planters also played a pivotal role in adapting and perfecting pot cultivation methods, turning it into the profitable venture. While some modern opinions in Colombia attribute the pot smelling boom to American influence, claiming that Peace Corps volunteers introduced the crop and cultivation methods, Brito disputes this notion. She argues that while Americans may have created the economic incentive, it was the local planters who ultimately capitalized on the booming industry, responding to the increased demand from the north. The pot smuggling boom brought a newfound wealth to many former cajacos turned pot smugglers. At its peak, Colombia supplied a staggering 70% of the United States pot. This influx of wealth significantly impacted the local economy and played a pivotal role in shaping Colombia's culture on a national scale, and in some ways was the precursor for going into the 80s and 90s, right? Throughout the 20th century, Colombia focused on expanding the banana export sector, establishing a cotton belt to supply domestic textile factories and implementing land redistribution programs. By the 1970s, Colombia was actively expanding its international trade with the United States. In fact, Colombia's industry enjoyed a relatively peaceful existence until 1978, when both the Colombian and U.S. governments initiated a militarized campaign aimed at eradicating crops and intensifying drug interdiction efforts. In response, traffickers retaliated, sparking the familiar pattern of an escalating conflict reminiscent of the war on drugs. As drug use became more prominent in mainstream culture, policymakers increasingly believed that combating drug production at its source was crucial. Now, President Nixon's establishment of the DEA in 1973 marked a turning point in this campaign. It represented intensified efforts that militarized the campaign against the production of this plant in Colombia and conceptualized by Bogota, the capital of Colombia, as the counterinsurgency operation. Now, ironically, the peak of the war on drugs in Colombia occurred during the Carter administration, which had initially advocated for the decriminalization of this plant, which was great. And for the most part, this is kind of where the Colombian gold starts to fade out. We're going into now the 70s. We're starting to see Pablo Escobar. We're starting to see Griselda Blanco. You know, while many people thought that they made their first millions off of the powder, no, actually a lot of these kingpins, they actually were millionaires before the powder. They were millionaires off the Colombian gold. Before we jump back into the video, I just want to say big thank you to Dr. Smoke for supporting this content. If you guys go over to drsmoke.com and use my discount code LMC, you're gonna get 15% off your entire order. Again, that's gonna be LMC, 15% off at drsmoke.com. They got all different types of products. Anyways, big thank you to the homies over at Dr. Smoke. Without them, none of this would be possible, so I can't thank them enough. Now, let's jump back into the content. But as we go into the 1970s, the Colombian gold starts to really ease up. Even though it's still supplying around 60% of all of the flour, this period saw the launch of the Two Peninsula Campaign. This is during the Carter administration, which is involving thousands of soldiers, undercover personnel, and DEA agents swarming the pot-growing region. Now, the writer, Brito, argues that this intensified enforcement eroded the, quote, moral economy that had previously prevented conflicts from escalating into violence. In 1994, the Colombian government took a significant step by decriminalizing the personal use of herb, and this move included pot as well as the harder substances like the powder. However, this decision faced substantial opposition, particularly from the United States, which viewed the move as an attempt to undermine the global war on drugs, and so the Colombians went back to the criminalization of that plant. Great job, guys. Look real stupid now, us Americans. 25 years later, we would then begin legalization. So the moment my home state, Washington State, and Colorado in 2012 legalized, well, Colombia followed suit right away. So in 2012, however, Colombia revisited its legal framework surrounding pot use, establishing that individuals caught with 20 grams or less of pot would not face prosecution, but might be referred for treatment depending on their level of impairment at the time of apprehension. It's essential to note that this leniency applied only when pot was found in a private residence, right? Now, in 2018, the stance faced criticism when Colombia's new president signed a decree granting police the authority to confiscate even small quantities of the plant, intending the personal use or not. Now, this amendment to the law did not subject offenders to criminal penalties, but instead imposed fines of up to 208,000 pesos. Currently, in Colombia, the sale or supply of pot is strictly illicit, even though, it's kind of not. Possessions of 20 grams or more of pot is considered intent to sell, and those caught can face imprisonment as a consequence. But although this trafficking is a significant concern for Colombia, it primarily revolves around the powder, not the flower. Now, regarding the cultivation of this plant, a pivotal change occurred in 2015. Individuals are now allowed to grow up to 20 plants without facing criminal charges, but only if the purpose is for personal use. Any other form of cultivation remains illicit. Now, despite this legal framework, many farmers across the country engage in herb cultivation, often as a means of supporting their families. Most of them, though, obviously do the cocoa plants, right? Now, in 2017, the first license to grow this plant were issued, and this attracted the interest of both the Colombian companies and the foreign enterprises looking to cultivate this plant in the country. So yeah, I was actually lucky enough to go to Colombia earlier this year, and then we ended up linking up with a couple of different, major, kind of bigger families in the agricultural space. And we learned a lot from them. Like, first of all, we learned that, right now, Colombia is at an all-time production high when it comes to the amount of powder that's being pushed and processed and grown in Colombia. And then, I was talking about the future of Colombia in terms of this plant. And I mean, it's highly corporatized in a lot of ways, right? There's a lot of international companies that have kind of laid their infrastructure down there. And I hope that we can see that the people from Colombia can benefit from this, newly starting to open up more and more market. I know it's not fully legal there yet, but I think overall there's really the big theme and takeaway from this video is to kind of showcase how, smuggling routes in general, when the government makes something illicit or restricts something, it creates an illicit market, a black market, right? And those typically are, establishing then smuggling routes, right? How do you get these illicit contraband through to places, A to B? And then stuff starts to build on itself, right? It starts out with the embargo in World War II. It then moves, trying to move bananas. Now they're growing the plant. They're growing the herb. That starts, more smuggling routes are laid down into the U.S. And then there kind of is a gateway for drug traffickers, right? For drug smugglers. Starts with herb, moves to other stuff when we talk about overall, countries like this. But yeah, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Big shouts out to Colombia if you're watching this from Colombia. I do apologize for all the mispronunciations. And I hope to be back out there soon. And hit me up, send me an email, all that. And if you're looking to work on the team, please send me an email, with a resume. We're looking for editors, writers, a number of other positions, so don't hesitate. Anyways, guys, I really, really appreciate you all. Make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, all that stuff. Links down below in the description. And like I said, big shouts out to Colombia. Anyways, this is LMC, signing out.